Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. President Trump confirmed Tuesday the White House is considering another tax cut as economists warn of a possible recession. Mr. Trump revealed the news in an Oval Office meeting with the president of Romania. But as Natalie Brand reports, the president continues to dismiss the idea that the economy is on the downturn.
During a meeting with the leader of Romania, the president acknowledged his administration is considering a tax cut to boost the economy.
Payroll tax is something that we think about, and a lot of people would like to see that, and that very much affects the workers of our country.
The president is also calling on the Federal Reserve to slash interest rates by a full percentage point, an amount the Fed would normally only consider during a recession.
I think that we actually are set for a tremendous surge of growth if the Fed would do its job.
Fears of an economic slowdown come as U.S. Steel sent a notice blaming current market conditions for the temporary layoff of less than 200 workers at its Great Lakes Works facility in Michigan. A majority of economists predict the U.S. is headed for recession by 2021 at the latest.
President Trump also continued to waver on expanding background checks less than 3 weeks after more than 30 people were killed in mass shootings in El Paso, Texas, and Dayton, Ohio.
We have very, very strong background checks right now. We are very strong on our Second Amendment. The Democrats are not strong at all in the Second Amendment. I would say they're weak on the Second Amendment, and we have to be careful of that.
The Senate's top Democrat, Chuck Schumer, called the president's walk back on background checks disappointing and heartbreaking. Natalie Brand, CBS News, the White House.
And joining me now are Dan Balz and Nancy Cook. Dan is a chief correspondent at the Washington Post covering national politics, the presidency, and Congress. And Nancy is a White House reporter for Politico. Welcome to both of you. Dan, before we delve into some of the politics of this, first of all, can you explain for our viewers where payroll taxes go and how cuts could impact everyday Americans?
Well, every worker pays payroll taxes. It goes into the Social Security system, and Medicare finances both of those programs. Even though the income tax is progressive, the payroll tax is not. Everybody pays essentially the same amount, and in fact, the amount that you pay is capped so that wealthier people actually pay a lower percentage of their salary than do average workers. So a payroll tax cut would certainly affect all workers, workers' families, but it would also have an impact on the money that technically goes into Social Security, although in fact everything goes into the same bucket.
Well, it was not that long ago, in fact, that the president and Congress pushed for those tax cuts in 2017. As I remember it, Dan, the idea there, according to the president at the time, was that that was going to help drive economic growth to 3%. Did that happen?
Well, it certainly helped stimulate the economy. There's no question about that. Did it get to the record or the levels that the president and some of his advisors talked about? No, in general, it did not. But the problem that they're now facing is that the impact of those big tax cuts has largely worked its way through the economy. There's not much stimulus left from those. And so if, in fact, there is another recession on the horizon, or that we actually go into a downturn, they have limited tools which to fight it, and payroll tax cuts would be one. The president said there are some other options that they're looking at. Interestingly, they're talking kind of in both directions. One, that the economy is very sound, and there are certainly indicators that would underscore that, but also that they are looking at some things in the event that we run into some economic turbulence in the future.
Right. And Nancy, it was interesting. Early Tuesday, the White House denied reports it was considering a payroll tax cut. Later that same day, President Trump confirmed that it was, and some suggest the original report was a trial balloon to test how well the idea would play with the public. What was the initial reaction?
Well, I think that, I don't know if it was a trial balloon, but it's certainly something that the White House internally has been considering for the last several days. They've also been considering a plan to potentially index the capital gains rate to inflation, which would be another attempt to boost the economy, as well as some other tax cuts. And I think that what they're really trying to do is both consider some policy levers that they could use if there is an economic slowdown, but they're also trying to show, this is really a messaging thing, that they are making policy moves and potentially policy considerations of what to do if there is an economic slowdown. No one I talked to today believes that another tax cut would pass through Capitol Hill, particularly with a Democrat-controlled House. But the administration is really searching for ways to show that they are thinking through what could happen if there's a global economic slowdown. And by talking about tax cuts, that's one way to show it.
So, Dan, in your Washington Post piece over the weekend headlined, "Trump has one playbook and very few plays left in it," you wrote, quote, "President Trump's statements over the past few days have brought into focus once again something fundamental about him. He has little understanding of what it means to govern. He would rather tweet from the bleachers." On Twitter Tuesday, the president attacked Fed Chair Jerome Powell, Michigan Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, his former communications director Anthony Scaramucci, and the media. Why is it that he continues to attack his perceived enemies in this way, specifically using Twitter to attack and go after his perceived enemies?
Well, one reason he does it is because he knows it attracts attention. And he loves to either attack or counterattack. If he feels that someone has been unkind to him, he will retaliate, and often retaliate in a much more significant way than he's been attacked. And people do pay attention to it. The media certainly pays attention to it. And it's one way that he is able to control the conversation and direct it into areas where he feels more comfortable than the things that are sitting in front of him. I mean, one of the points I was trying to make in that article was that there are some quite serious problems that are confronting him and that are confronting the country, and yet he seems to be, focused much more on the size of the crowd that he had in New Hampshire last week, or the spat that he's in with the four members of the Congress who are known as the Squad, or other things like that, and that it's almost as though there's an unseriousness about the way he is approaching governing. Politically, we know he's pretty shrewd and pretty smart and knows what he wants to do. But in terms of governing the country, I think there's a gap there between the size of the problems and the seriousness with which he sometimes approaches them.
I want to turn to the issue of gun control. The president says that he is a strong believer in the Second Amendment. He appears to be backing away, perhaps, from his previous support for expanded background checks. Nancy, what might be behind that?
Well, I think that he's really been hearing from, NRA officials, from Republicans on the Hill. And the president, you have to remember, is always very, very attuned to his conservative base. That's something that he's always been very focused on the gun control issue, but just, across the spectrum of policy issues. So I think he's heard from people, and I think that there is a concern, particularly heading into an election year, that he doesn't want to do anything that endangers that base. And I think that he feels like if there was expanded background checks, that's something that could be politically a losing issue for him.
And Dan, this is not the first time that we've seen President Trump seemingly back away from expanded background checks. At this point, is there a sort of a pattern that's been established here on this issue of gun control where, unfortunately, this has been a regular enough occurrence during this presidency, where we have seen him now once again seem to support an idea and now then have lukewarm support, or at least at this moment have it be unclear whether or not he is committed to the idea of perhaps getting behind some sort of gun control legislation?
Yeah, it certainly feels like we've seen this movie at least a few times, and there was, in a strange way, there was a certain predictability about this. At the moment of those shootings in Dayton and El Paso, with the country focused on these issues, the president wanted to appear as though he was kind of in tune with the way the whole country was thinking about this. But the farther we have gotten away from that, and the more he has heard from people in his base, the more he is reluctant to push forward and to really use any political capital on his part. Obviously, this could help him with his base, but I think that the trade-off on that is what does it do to suburban voters, and particularly women voters in the suburbs. We know that universal background checks have near universal support almost across the political spectrum, 80, 85, 90% support. And a lot of of people, particularly those suburban voters, could be crucial to his reelection fortune. So the degree to which he solidifies his base by backing away from this, he runs the risk of turning off people who might have voted for him in 2016 for whatever reason, but will say in the end, I've had enough of this and I don't want to do that again.
I want to ask about something else the president brought up in his Oval Office remarks. The president also talked about Jewish Americans who vote for Democrats, and this comes after Israel barred Congresswomen Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar from entering. Here's what the president said.
Where has the Democratic Party gone? Where have they gone where they're defending these two people over the state of Israel? And I think any Jewish people that vote for a Democrat, I think it shows either a total lack of knowledge or great disloyalty.
So, Dan, Pew Research found that 79% of American Jews voted for Democrats in the 2018 midterms. What is the president trying to do here?
Well, he's trying to divide that constituency, but it's not clear that he will have much success on that. I mean, I think that the issue was whether he should have weighed in on the question of whether Israel would or would not allow the two congresswomen into Israel last week. There's obviously controversy around the two of them and what they've had to say about Israel, and that's an important issue. But on this question, I think that the controversy is the president's action and whether that was appropriate. And I think that, you know, as we've seen historically, the Jewish vote goes very heavily Democratic, and there's not a great deal of likelihood that that's going to change in any significant way.
Well, Nancy, over the weekend, the New York Times featured an Orthodox rabbi in Washington. He said, quote, if Israel equals Trump, then there is a concern that opposition to Trump will transition into opposition to Israel. Could the president's words here have the opposite effect as he's intending?
Well, I think that what the president constantly is obsessed with is whether or not someone is loyal to him and the Republican Party. But you can't necessarily cast like a whole group of religious people or a whole group of any people as loyal or disloyal based on how they support him or a country. That's just not really a helpful thing to do. And I think that what we've seen with Trump time and time again is that he tends to divide people into loyal or not loyal rather than as an elected leader serving as the country of all people. You know, he's constantly in campaign mode where he's looking for an us versus them mentality. And we saw that today with his comments about how Jewish voters could potentially be disloyal if they are supporting Democrats.
All right, well, finally, I'd like to play a clip from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's interview with CBS This Morning, Tuesday. Let's listen to that.
What we've always said is the caliphate's been gone and that there's always risk that there'll be a resurgence, not just from ISIS. There's risk from al-Qaeda, other radical Islamic terrorist groups. President Trump is very focused on making sure that we apply the right resources against the problems set everywhere to protect the homeland and keep the American people safe. We'll do that.
Is it gaining strength in your opinion?
It's complicated. There's certainly places where ISIS is more powerful today than they were 3 or 4 years ago. But the caliphate is gone, and their capacity to conduct external attacks has been made much more difficult. We've taken down significant risk. Not all of it, but a significant amount. And we're very pleased with the work that we've done.
So those comments come after President Trump said that, quote, we won against ISIS. Dan, what should we take away from this?
Well, I think what we should take away is that this is not a static situation, and that as U.S. forces have been moved or withdrawn, there is an opportunity for ISIS or others, other terrorist organizations, to begin to rekindle or rebuild or add to recruits. And it's the notion of we have to be constantly vigilant on these issues and these threats. In a sense, the same question arises as to what might happen if we, in fact, do withdraw U.S. forces from Afghanistan in a deal with the Taliban, and what could happen to Afghanistan, and would that become then a safe haven for terrorists again, as it had been before? So the Middle East is a tinderbox at all times, and the question is the degree to which the U.S. foreign policy is truly making the U.S. safer or not paying enough attention, and those threats are rising. And that's a constant problem that any president in this era is going to have to worry about.
Absolutely. All right, Dan Balz and Nancy Cook, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.